Meine Damen und Herren, guten Abend. Ich möchte Sie zur zweiten Vorlesung in diesem Zyklus über Philosophie in den Einstein-Vorlesungen von diesem Jahr begrüßen und schon jetzt sagen, vergessen Sie nicht, morgen um 7:30 gibt es die dritte Vorlesung. Also passen Sie heute gut auf, damit Sie morgen dann auch noch wieder gescheite Fragen stellen können. Zur kurzen Einführung übergebe ich an Herrn Stepanians.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich hatte, okay, I switch into English. I have introduced Simon Blackburn yesterday extensively, and so, but for those of you who couldn't make it yesterday, I just wanted to show you that if you Google Simon Blackburn philosophy, the links that come up, I think the third link that comes up, at least on my Google, is the link to Simon Blackburn's website. And this is a very nicely done website. You have to click on the pictures. There you have the man himself, but then here are his books, and there is, look, this picture alone I think is worth going on that website. And the books that he has written, and then there are lecture notes, there are a special, beautifully, I mean, Simon Blackburn is an excellent writer. Prose flows like honey, and he is not only a good philosopher who is he's not only a good philosopher, he's a philosopher who can write well, and that's a very rare species. And moreover, he's extremely funny. And you can, especially in his reviews that he writes, and here there are some photographs, also he's also a photographer, and here are some wonderful reviews that he has written, and he is, I think, especially witty and entertaining there. So much for those of you who did not, who were not here yesterday. But now let's go to the important part. Simon.
Thank you very much again, Marcus. Yes, I very much, I feel very modest about my writing, but I do try. Okay, in this second lecture, I think I want to go to there, yes, I think, did we get, yes. In the first lecture, just to catch up, I talked a little bit about Einstein's philosophy of science, and we got on to Pierre Duhem, and we got on to what was wrong with the idea of correspondence truth. I was at pains to say that it's not so much that the very idea that truth is correspondence with the facts. That idea is perfectly all right, just taken as an equivalence. But what philosophers have queried is whether we have a sufficient grasp of what the facts are for it to amount to an interesting remark about truth, a kind of unpacking or an analysis or a help in understanding the notion of truth. And that's what the philosophers that I put up here deny. They don't think that it does help, and they think that the idea that it helps is very obfuscatory. It's a bad idea. I think, yes. And various other philosophers of science. Here we have got Brian Ellis and Thomas Kuhn, and I showed those and talked about them a bit yesterday. Today I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. I'm going to talk about the assault on representation, which you get from some people who call themselves pragmatists, who follow the pragmatist tradition of C.S. Peirce. By the way, can you all hear me? I got some evidence that last night my voice didn't carry to the back, or I mumbled a bit. You check. It's all right now, is it? Good. It sounds a bit louder in my own ear. Yes, I'm going to talk about philosophers who think of themselves as following the pragmatist tradition of Charles Sanders Peirce, who's there with his splendid late Victorian beard, William James, and John Dewey. Now, Peirce, James, and Dewey themselves voiced the kind of thing that I was talking about yesterday. I could have put up quotations from them. But it's particularly their attack on representation, the idea of representational truth, that I want to talk about today. Well, a good quotation, I think, comes from John Dewey. Dewey was, yes, if you want a prize for the philosopher who's written the most, I think John Dewey probably gets it. There was a centenary edition of his works, just a bibliography listing his writings. Now, if you think that he lasted a long time, he wrote for about 60 years. Now, if you think of a good professional career in philosophy, somebody, say, such as myself, but more voluble, you might think that you might write, what, 12 books, something like that. You might write 4 papers a year. That would be a lot, 240 papers. So all in all, about 250 items you might write. And if you think that in a bibliography you could get perhaps 25 on a page, then a bibliography of somebody's works would be about 10 pages. And that would amount to a good, hard-working professional career in philosophy. The centenary bibliography of Dewey's works ran to 150 pages. So that's what I mean by saying that he wrote a lot. Dewey is often credited with having attacked the idea of representation, but I think that's slightly inaccurate. So I'm going to talk about this quotation from one of his later works, volume 12 of his later works. The basic fallacy in representative realism is that while it actually depends upon the inferential phase of inquiry, we'll come back to that, it fails to interpret the immediate quality and the related idea in terms of their function in inquiry. On the contrary, it views representative power as an inherent property of sensations and ideas as such, treating them as representations in and of themselves. So the idea is that people have tried to understand the representative powers of the mind by thinking in terms of something that in and of itself represents a different reality, points beyond itself. And this is the idea that Dewey is attacking. If you think like that, you're not going to dwell very long on the idea that words in and of themselves have this power. Words conceived of just as perturbations of sound or squiggles on pieces of paper, they obviously require interpretation. They don't, as it were, carry by some kind of magic power the ability to point beyond themselves to an aspect of reality. So if you take the word red to refer to a color, it's because of something you bring to it. We find that obvious and quite amusing. If you, for example, point. We all know about pointing. If I point over there, you'll know that I'm trying to draw your attention to something over there. It's often dog owners are often amused that if they point, meaning the dog to go over there and do something, the dog's very likely just to look at their finger. The dog doesn't interpret the finger as a sign that it should pay attention to something over there. Similarly, words on paper. Obviously, you could pick up a text written in something like Icelandic and you wouldn't have the first idea what it said. And that's true for many other languages. There's only one language or 2 or 3 that you know how to interpret. And that knowledge took some learning and it gave you a skill. And that's what Dewey is going to mean by the inferential phase of inquiry, the kind of skills that surround your ability to interpret words. But a natural thought, and the thought that I think the people that can't attack, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the British empiricists, can't attack those 3 as sensualizing the understanding. And I think what they did was they thought that we interpreted words by associating them with ideas in our mind. And ideas in our mind had this magical power of pointing beyond themselves. And that's the view that Dewey's attacking. He says, after he says, On the contrary, it views representative power as an inherent property of sensations and ideas as such, treating them as representations in and of themselves. He goes on to say, dualism or bifurcation of mental and physical existence is a necessary result, presented, however, not as a result, but as a given fact. Psychological or mental existences which are then endowed with the miraculous power of standing for and pointing to existences of a different order. So what Dewey is attacking there, you might call semantic primitivism. He's attacking the idea that we get to understand semantic power as the power of meaning, the power of words to mean things. He's attacking the idea that we can understand semantic power by associating words with these magical presences in the mind with, which by some kind of mysterious power, magical power, point beyond themselves. And that's his enemy. It was a similar enemy of Wittgenstein's. At the very beginning of the Blue and Brown books, Wittgenstein gives the example of you obeying the order, bring me a red flower. He says, how do people obey that order? Because after all, I've only given them a word. And he says, well, you might think that this is what happens. On hearing the word red, you conjure up an idea of red, and then you try to find a flower that matches that idea. And Wittgenstein says, this isn't the usual way of searching for a flower. And to see that it's not, imagine somebody obeying the command, imagine a red flower. You don't think there that you obey the command, imagine a red flower, by, as it were, having a second order image of a red flower, and you then call to mind an image of a red flower which matches the first one that you got. There's no such regress. You just know which kind of flower to bring or which kind of image to conjure up. But that knowledge is not explained by the fact that you manage to obey the command. It merely repeats the fact that you manage to obey the command, as it were. Well, I think Dewey is not attacking the very idea of representation. He's attacking the idea that it's done in this primitive way by means of citing the magical powers of a kind of thing. So what do you have to do instead? Well, you have to look, and we learned this to some extent from Dewey. You have to look at the entire practice, the entire set of practices, the way of life, as Wittgenstein would have called it, within which your understandings are embedded. And this is the, as it were, the mantra, the advice of pragmatism. This is what Peirce was anxious to stress, and in their different way, James, and here's Dewey stressing the same thing. So you've got to look at the practices. Well, somebody who took Dewey to mount an attack on representation in general was Richard Rorty. And I want to give you something of the flavor of Rorty's writings on this subject. Very intelligent philosopher, taught at Princeton and then at many other places. Probably the sort of Anglo-American version of postmodernism, or postmodernist writing. Rorty acted as a kind of ambassador, bringing Paris to the United States, or to United States philosophy. If you look at the second quotation there, I don't know why I put that first one first. Nothing counts as justification unless by reference to what we already accept, and there is no way to get outside our beliefs and our language so as to find some test other than coherence. Well, that's familiar to us. That's exactly the kind of thought that we found in Dewey yesterday. So here's Rorty echoing Dewey. But Rorty, as it were, takes this further. He says, he talks about language use as a kind of tool, which again is a pragmatist view. Pragmatism emphasizes practice. He says there's no way in which tools can take one out of touch with reality. He's talking about touch with reality. No matter whether the tool is a hammer or a gun or a belief or a statement, tool using is part of the interaction of the organism with its environment. And that's something that Dewey would have said as well. Dewey was very keen on giving a biologically realistic picture of human powers. To see the employment of words as the use of tools to deal with the environment, rather than as an attempt to represent the intrinsic nature of that environment, is to repudiate the question of whether human minds are in touch with reality. The question asked by the epistemological skeptic. No organism, human or non-human, is ever more or less in touch with reality than any other organism. So the idea of being especially in touch with reality, which you might think belongs to people who've got their feet on the ground, people who don't have their heads in the air, people who aren't taken in by ideologies, people who don't listen to Donald Trump. You might think that those are the people who are especially in touch with reality. But Rory is telling us that this is wrong, that this is being in touch with reality is a democratic right, and beyond democratic because it also belongs to other organisms. And of course, there's something right about that. If you take being in touch with literally, then everything from the most microscopic form of life in the sea to ourselves is going to be in touch with reality. But one wonders what that's got to do with describing things truly or falsely. Well, Rory goes on to say things like this. We understand knowledge best when we understand the social justification of belief, and thus have no need to view it as accuracy of representations. Instead of seeing vertical relationships between language or ourselves as language users and the world, we must concentrate upon horizontal or inferential processes whereby we advance and accept reasons from each other. Justification becomes a social phenomenon rather than a transaction between a knowing subject and reality, in inverted commas. So a shorthand way of putting that, which he often adopted, was to say that we understand language by seeing it as an instrument for coping, not for copying. And William James had said more or less the same thing. He thought that representational views of language powers, linguistic powers, were in effect trying to say that with language we copy the world. And James is often quite amusing about that. He asked, why on earth should we want a copy of the world? Isn't one of the damn things enough? So that's an enemy of James as well as of Rory. Well, is representation a good notion to work with? And you might be scratching your heads at this point and saying, well, you know, representation, is it as bad? Are these vertical relationships between ourselves and the world quite as bad as Rory seems to think? Dewey, after all, was attacking representational primitivism, the idea that it's primitive, that it depends on a magical power that some element of a thing called our mind has. But Dewey wasn't himself attacking the very notion of representation. And you might expect some kickback from philosophers saying, you know, what's going on here, roughly? And the voice of the kickback is, I think, very well embodied in this person, Frank Jackson, an Australian professor, works amongst other places at Princeton quite often. And Jackson's complaint, which I think I showed this slide last night, is that he has been at conferences in which people attacking representation nevertheless have in their pockets pieces of paper with writing on them that tell them where the conference dinner is and when the taxis leave for the airport. And of course, the right thing to say about those pieces of paper seems to be that they represent, they tell Jackson where the conference dinner is and when the taxis leave for the airport. There's a relationship with the world. And if the pieces of paper get that relationship wrong, then you miss the taxis or you miss the dinner. So can we sort of rehabilitate some common sense notion of representation? in the face of the pragmatist, or at any rate the Dewey stroke Rory skepticism about it? Well, I think we can. So let's just unpack what I think is implicit in Frank Jackson's complaint. So let's say here we've got Mercator. I'm going to take Mercator. You've all heard of Mercator's projection. Mercator is the great map maker of the early modern period. So I'm going to take him as a specimen maker of maps. And as a specimen reader of maps, this slightly droopy girl is Ophelia from Hamlet. And Ophelia wants to know where the pond is so she can go and drown herself. That's her project. So Mercator can make a map, and Ophelia is going to turn into a reader of the map. Now, to make a map, Mercator has to use various symbols. He's going to, for example, put in a compass. He's going to put in an arrow suggesting which direction is north, possibly the sign N next to it. He's going to give you a scale. He's going to perhaps have a symbol for something like Elsinore. That's where the hamlet is situated. And he's going to have to add other symbols. Here's a, this isn't actually from one of Mercator's maps. This is from the contemporary English Ordnance Survey map, but still, you get the idea. And there's perhaps bottom left here, water activities. So that might be a symbol of particular interest to Ophelia. But of course, there are many others. So there's Ophelia. And she's got to be able to read quite a lot of the symbols. She's got to know, and it's very natural to use the word here, she's got to know what they represent. It's actually quite a skill reading an Ordnance Survey map, because some of the symbols, although they're listed at the side of the map, and that's the list I took a photograph of, they're not always self-explanatory. And it's quite a skill to learn to read a map. So she's going to have to do a little bit of work to become a reader of the map. But supposing, first of all, Mercator is a good map maker, and secondly, Ophelia is a good reader of the map. What has Mercator done? Well, has he coped or has he copied? Neither words sort of just seems helpful on the face of it. He's certainly done something which is of great practical use. Maps are useful, that's why they're in the shops, and that's why they're expensive, and why people are prepared to pay money for them. So he's done something which enables you to cope with the world better. He's provided you with an instrument. But how did he do this? Well, he didn't do it by copying the landscape, but he did go out and do it by observing the landscape, or having assistants who observed the landscape and gave him the results of their observations, and by measuring the landscape and by accurately reproducing the topography of the landscape in his map. To do that, he's got to use various conventions, and those are the conventions which are listed there at the side. So he's got a convention illustrating a museum, a castle, a fort, buildings of historic interest, viewpoints, horse riding, all sorts of things. A viewpoint isn't much like horse riding, but both of those can be represented on the map. So these are conventional signs which Ophelia has learnt to read, and as a result, Ophelia's got a skill transmitted to her, given to her. She can take Mercator's observations as her own, as it were. So the first generalization we might make is that Mercator's an accurate map maker, and to be such, his language entries, his entries into the map, must be responsible to observations. Now, following Dewey and Rory, and also the British idealists that I talked to you about last night, observation has tended to get slightly missed out. There's a theme in Rory and in Davidson. I forget whether I quote this later on. I should. I don't know whether I did. There's a theme in these writers that suggests an overall picture which is now known as inferentialism. And it's a substitute. It substitutes these vertical relationships with the world that Rory doesn't like, and it substitutes for those inferential processes of reasoning from one proposition to another. And the idea is that justification, you only justify a proposition by citing some other proposition from which you can infer it. So the picture of language becomes one of and you interpret a proposition by perhaps seeing what follows from it, by inferring downwind from it, something that you might predict or expect or something else. So this substitutes a kind of self-contained picture of a language. And that seems inadequate in all sorts of ways. The people who first sort of fell victim to this, this sort of recoil from the idea of representational relations between language and the world, the people who first recoiled from it and I think fell victim to that recoil were known as coherence theorists of truth. And what they're substituting and what inferential substitutes for our language is something like a picture of an internally structured web of inferential relations between sentences. What about observation, you say? Well, the idea is that there's, and this again would have been congenial to Dewey, that there's no self-extracting, self-interpreting process. There's never an idea in your mind, whether it's there as a result of observation or anything else, which carries its own meaning with it. So you have to interpret observation. That's obviously true. We're very good at it, of course. We're very practiced at it, but we do it. And then so observation, as it were, falls out of the picture. Observation is just a way in which quite a lot of beliefs get into the entire web of your belief. And then after that, it takes its place in the inferential structure that you have. But this doesn't do justice to what Mercator has to do. Mercator doesn't just infer from other propositions already in his mind that there's a pond here or a viewpoint there or horse riding there. He goes and looks. He institutes a process of making himself causally responsive to aspects of the environment. So I think what the coherence theorists forgot, and what, following them, Rory forgot, and what Davidson forgot, it's almost a kind of professional defamation of the whole world of 1970s to 2000 philosophy, is that observation shouldn't be pegged as simply the fact that you're in an environment and causally responsive to it. It should be pegged as something more like the intelligent ability to increase the accuracy within which you're capable of representing aspects of the environment. You increase your accuracy from perhaps being no better than chance. After all, if I get a blank sheet of paper and I put a squiggle which is supposed to mean Elsinore here, and without looking I then put a symbol which is supposed to mean water sports here, even if I put a scale and an orientation of the map and so on it, I'm no likely to be better than chance. What's the chance of water sports being where I say they are? Virtually zero. So without observation, without causal responsiveness to aspects of the environment, which you then, in a rule-governed way, represent on your map, you're not going to be a very good map maker. So Mercator has not just to infer about aspects of the environment from other things in his mind already. He has to actually go out and conduct observations. It's a peculiarity that people like Rory and to some extent Davidson, calling themselves pragmatists, seem to forget about this practical aspect of our embodiment in the world. I don't think Dewey forgot about it. Two of Dewey's favorite words are inquiry and education. So the idea of becoming an educated inquirer, that is an inquirer who's mastered various techniques of inquiry, is front and center in Dewey's writings. It was part of his vast output that he wrote a lot about education, and these are the kind of practices which he emphasized as an educationalist. So what I'm doing is trying to push back against a pure coherentist, pure inferentialist conception of our understanding of the world. And say, well, no, the intelligent engagement with the world is part of the picture. And again, I mentioned that Dewey, for example, was very keen to diminish the difference between us and other animals. He wanted a biologically realistic picture of what we're like. And if you think of the interpretation of animals or organisms' behaviors, you'll see that the stress on observation, which I've been giving, and the stress on being able to respond in a practically sensible way to a signal is very much part and parcel of primitive animal communication. Many of you will have heard of Carl von Frisch, the great field biologist who first investigated the so-called waggle dance of honeybees. When the honeybee goes foraging, perhaps it finds a source of pollen, and when it's found a source of pollen, it comes back to the hive and it performs this waggle dance, and following observation of the waggle dance, which is itself observation, of course, the other bees rush off in the right direction for the right distance and in the right numbers, all of which was signaled to them by elements of the dance. So the bee goes through certain motions. As a result of those motions, the conspecifics, the other bees in the hive, are able, apparently, I'm taking this on hearsay, I haven't done the observations myself, but this is what von Frisch was famous for, are able apparently to interpret the waggle in terms of the distance away that there's pollen, the orientation, that is the direction in which there is pollen, and the amount of pollen there is. So they don't send a whole number of bees to a rather poor source. They do send a whole number of bees to a rather rich source. So here you've got the way in which a biologically realistic account of an animal signaling system can be developed. And you see that it's got to start with observation. There's then, no doubt by evolutionary processes, built up a way in which the purport of the observation can be transmitted to members of the hive, and then there's a successful practice as a result of it. And this is exactly like the relationship between Mercator and Ophelia. Suppose Mercator is an accurate map maker. To be such, his language entries, his entries into his map, must be responsive to observations. Let's suppose that Ophelia can read and understand the conventions governing those symbols, conventions of distance, conventions of direction, conventions of what you're going to find at the end of that journey. Then we get that Ophelia is likely to be successful in many navigations she undertakes, and more successful than if she hadn't used the map at all. So that's the net purport of map making and map reading. Now, a deflationist about truth perhaps I should say a little bit more to justify to introduce and justify deflationism. I mentioned this last night, but I mentioned it mainly in connection with the attack on the correspondence theory of truth. I'll just talk a bit more about deflationism. Last night we got the Frege argument, if you remember, against the correspondence theory, that is true seems to add no content to a belief. P, it's true that P, it's really true that P, it's true that it's really true that P, it's a fact that it's really true that P, and so on. All that ladder is getting you nowhere. It's not adding to what you first believed, P, whatever that was. The theory of truth, which best tries to make sense of that observation of Frege's, is nowadays called deflationism, sometimes called a minimalist theory of truth, but that's a bit confusing because other theories have gone under that title, so I'd call it deflationism. And the fundamental deflationist idea put by a philosopher called Paul Horwich, whose book on truth was published in 1990, very good book indeed, and I strongly recommend it to any students in the room. According to Horwich, the way to expound deflationism is to say, look, if you realize that the TP, it's true that P and P are equivalent, you are then equipped to understand any use of the notion of truth. That's all you need to know, is that equivalence thesis, that there's no difference in content between a proposition and the proposition that proposition is true. And this is surprising because you might think that truth has other powers. For example, consider the proposition that science is successful, enables us to do things successfully because science is true or largely true about the phenomena that it investigates. Or science puts truth or something near to truth into our minds. It substitutes information about these things for guesses, and by doing so it puts us in touch with the truth, and that's why science is successful. Now that's a direct contradiction, as it were, of something we saw Rory saying, which is that all animals are equally in touch with the truth. That's just not true. Science enables us to get particularly in touch with the truth. At least that's a natural thought. And it's a natural thought that the truth or the near truth of science explains its success. So how does a deflationist like Horwich cope with that thought? Can he give any substitute for that thought? Well, the answer is that he can and does. And the way it works is this. He says, look, to say that science is successful because it puts you in touch with the truth is a generalization. And it's a generalization across a lot of instances which themselves make no use of the notion of truth. So it's a shorthand way of saying that, our rockets land on the moon when we direct them at the moon because Newton's laws are true or roughly true. Newton's laws of motion are true or roughly true, and we design our rockets and their trajectories using those laws. That's a perfectly good thing to say, but you can say it without using the notion of truth. You can say it, you say our rockets land on the moon because action and reaction are equal and opposite. Because science says that action and reaction are equally opposite, and action and reaction are equal and opposite. You see, I just repeated the proposition which was supposed to be doing the explanation. And by repeating it, I'm asserting it. And by asserting it, I don't need to go on and say it's true. That would add nothing. Or I could say, our rockets land on the moon because bodies attract each other with a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Okay? Our rockets land on the moon because science tells us that bodies attract each other with a force which is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. And bodies do attract each other with a force that's inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Again, I don't have to make any notion of truth as I use the proposition that science tells us and say that science tells us that, and that's so, I say, by saying it. So I just have to repeat whatever's said. I don't have to talk about its truth. So when I sum up all these individual explanations, all of which can be made without mentioning a notion of truth, I'm then in a position to say, as a generalization, science enables us to be successful because it gives us truths, or near truths. Science enables us to be more successful than we would otherwise be because it's right about things, or near enough right about things. And of course, that's going to be true about Mercator. Mercator enables Ophelia to fulfill her project of going and drowning herself because Mercator is right about the position of the pond vis-a-vis Elsinore. And saying he's right is a way of saying he gets it right. His map represents it truly. But that just means that Mercator's map, unraveling Mercator's map, you can read that there's a pond half a mile north-northeast of Elsinore, or whatever it might be, and say a kilometre, let me say, since I'm on the continent, kilometre north-northeast of Elsinore. And there is a pond a kilometre north-northeast of Elsinore. So as a result, Ophelia knows where to go, and as a result, she's successful in her project of drowning herself. So Horwich can use generalizations which do use the notion of truth, but he'll say the value of those generalizations is simply to sum up a whole mass of explanations, none of which themselves need to mention any semantic notion, any notion like truth or representation or anything else. So I think that's as it were, the defense of deflationism which I'd like to offer. So the deflationist account of, remember we had generalizations. Mercator is an accurate map maker. Second generalization, Ophelia can read and understand its conventions. Third generalization, Ophelia is likely to be successful in many navigations she undertakes. And the deflationist account of those generalizations is going to be whenever Mercator says that P, then P, and never Mercator says that P but not P. Substitutions for P will be things like Mercator says that there's a pond a kilometre north-northeast of Elsinore. If Mercator says that, then there is a pond north-northeast of Elsinore, a kilometre north-northeast of Elsinore. And he wouldn't say it if it wasn't so. He wouldn't say that there's a pond when there's not a pond. Whenever Mercator says that there's a pond north-northeast of Elsinore by positioning sign X on his map, Ophelia will believe that there's a pond north-northeast of, a kilometre north-northeast of Elsinore. And it's never of Elsinore. And it's never so that Mercator says that P and Ophelia believes that not P. That's just a way of saying Ophelia can read the map. So Ophelia can be right about where things are as a result of reading the map. And hence, Ophelia is likely to be successful in her projects. This has been misunderstood, I think, by some very good philosophers. In a book called Preludes to Pragmatism, Philip Kitcher thinks that generalizations in terms of Mercator's accuracy provide a better explanation and prediction of Ophelia's success than the deflationary versions, and that rehabilitates a sort of correspondence. But I think pragmatists will deny this, and I think they're right to deny it. They must admit that Mercator has to be causally guided in making language entries. It's only because he keeps his eyes open, roughly, that Mercator's better than chance at entering into his map, that's a language entry, entering into his map the information that he does. That's what makes him accurate. But the pragmatist will deny that that guidance involves any primitive semantic relation, such as representation or correspondence. What it will involve is Mercator knowingly and intelligently putting himself in a position which radically increases the chance that if he says that P, then P. And that's what observation does. So the mistake of pure inferentialism or pure coherence theory of truth, in my book, is that it mistakes the potency, the power, and the necessity of observation. Observation isn't just the arrival of more ideas in your head. So when people like Rory and following him Davidson say that only a belief can justify another belief, which is one of the mantras of both Rory and Davidson, I would argue that they're wrong. There are things other than beliefs that justify beliefs. Observation justifies beliefs, and observation justifies beliefs by making it far more probable that your beliefs are true if they're a result of that process than if they're not. And if that doesn't count as justification, then I think nothing does. So pure inferentialism is a marvelous phrase by the Oxford philosopher John McDowell here, who said that Rory and Davidson, and he could have said this about the British idealists, they leave you with a picture of thought spinning frictionlessly in the void. In other words, they give you the idea of a galaxy of sentences with masses of inferential relations between them, but as it were, with no outside. Language doesn't have an outside. It's only got these inward-looking inferential relations between one sentence and another. And that's wrong. Language has the intelligent, rational response to experience, which we can make, and the intelligent, rational response to signals, which Ophelia can make, that is, by modifying her practice in accordance with what she's told. And that increases Ophelia's chance of success in action. So there's intelligence both at the input side and at the output side. Now, I think that's forgotten not only by Rory and Davidson, but by some contemporary philosophers. I think both Hugh Price and Bob Brandom, this is for experts, but those of you who know those writings, if you read them, you'll see that the emphasis is only on the internal conceptual structure and not at all on the external practices that give rise to it. Brandom, at one point, compares our embodiment, our being in the world, and therefore, in principle, causally responsive to the world, with the way in which, for example, a piece of iron rusts if it's in a damp environment. It's just a passive process of receiving, as it were, forces from nature, and that's got nothing to do with reasoning, has it? And that's the kicker, because I want to say yes, but the intelligent practice of making observations isn't just the passive reception of causal forces from the environment. It is that, but it's more than that, because it involves the intelligent ability to manipulate your situation so that you increase your chances of the truth about something, of being right about something. And I think this does something to resurrect a much more realistic conception of epistemology than you get from the idea of a language game. The very idea of a language game, Brandon talks of our thought in terms of the the language game, the game of giving and asking for reasons, one of his favorite sentences, one of his favorite phrases to describe this. First of all, I don't think it's a game. I think that's already, as it were, pushing you towards the idea of a self-contained activity, like a crossword puzzle. You don't have to make observations beyond the clues of the puzzle. You just make inferential moves and eventually you solve the puzzle. That's fine for a game, but it's not fine for the business of living in the world. Living in the world requires observation, it requires investigation, it requires the directed, intelligent approach which enables you eventually to increase your chance of being right about things. So I think that we have to rehabilitate some sense of the full, as it were, scale of the relationship between Mercator and Ophelia in order to do justice to any of this. And this means we're going to look with a very beady eye on the idea of our thought processes as spinning frictionlessly in the void. And we're going to insist, no, they have rational and intelligent relationships with things which are external to them. Now, of course, Dewey's point remains right, that we don't, as it were, retreat to semantic primitivism. We don't retreat to the idea that observation is simply, as it were, the passive reception of ideas, which then by themselves indicate truths about the world. No, it's not that. It is rather putting yourself in the position that I've mentioned, which is no more than bees do, or other animals which receive information from the environment and direct their actions according to it. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward. So there's no harm in admitting that the symbols of Mercator's map, represent this or that. It's just that the Mercator-Ophelia relationship is not fundamentally described that way. Doing so will ignore the epistemological, inferential, and holistic skills enabling representation and underlying it. So we're quite happy still with Duhem. There's no reason why we shouldn't accept some version of Duhem's holism, why we shouldn't accept some version of Duhem's concentration on inferential practices. We can even, if you like, accept the underdetermination of theory by data. After all, if you think of the skills required for good observation, you'll see that you already get underdetermination. You get underdetermination of observation by data, if you like. Just think of a case where there's an expert and there's somebody who's not expert. Go hunting for mushrooms in the woods in August. You and I can both see the same mushroom. In that sense, we make the same observation. But the expert can interpret what he sees and counsel you not to touch that or to touch the other. You could say, no, that's the death's cap mushroom. If you take that, you will die. Or that's a nice sap, and if you take that, you'll have a nice dinner. And it's very important to gain that skill before you go hunting for mushrooms in the woods. But you or I, or at any rate I, can look at a mushroom and I haven't the first idea what I'm looking at, and certainly not the first idea whether it's poisonous or not. So the practiced and skilled observation takes learning like anything else. Okay, so that was the Mercator-Ophelia relation. In the light of all this, I now want to talk about a new kid on the block, also dear to the heart of quite a lot of modern philosophers. From Horridge, from deflationism about truth, we get the idea. All that I've said about observation, none of it is supposed to impugn deflationism about truth. What it does do is impugn an inference from that to a pure coherence theory or pure inferentialism. And I hope that's plain. But in the light of this, where does semantic stand? Where do semantic relationships stand? Well, the fundamental semantic relationship for a long time has been thought to be the relationship between a sentence and its interpretation. This is what you get if you read the great logician Alfred Tarski, who gives you what are called T-sentences. Tarski thought that by giving T-sentences, which I'll explain in a minute, you gave, as it were, the interpretation of a language. And a T-sentence is as follows. Suppose I'm interpreting, I don't know, German in English. I got English as my native tongue, and I want to give an account of German. And I might watch some German speakers for a while. Suppose I've got no one who's willing to translate for me. And then I tentatively make entries in a theory about how German works. Well, how do I do this? Well, I look and see what the natives seem to draw attention to, what they seem to do, rather like von Frisch and his bees. Look at what the signs might seem to do by way of creating variation in reaction on the part of people who witness them. And then I might enter various theses about German. I might say that Schnee ist weiß is true in German. It seems, if and only if snow is white. That seems to be the circumstance which sets Germans off to say Schnee ist weiß. And so on for thousands and thousands of other sentences. And if I'm good enough, eventually I could build up a complete theory of that form. It's going to be I can't do it just by means of a list, because German, like other natural languages, has a recursive structure. There's no limit to the complexity and the number of sentences that can be made. So I'm going to need to know something about the structure of German. And to do this, I'm eventually going to select out various semantic powers that elements of sentences have. And that's quite a difficult thing to do. It would be very difficult if I was dealing with a language more foreign to me than German. For example, Chinese, Mandarin, the semantics of spoken sentences changes with the pitch at which they're uttered. It's a pitch language. Being unfamiliar with pitch languages, I might find it very difficult to tune my ear, actually, to the requisite precision to enable me to interpret spoken Chinese, and it is very difficult. But most European languages have more or less the same powers, and it's therefore relatively straightforward to seize on the subsentential features which are semantically relevant, that is, which alter the kind of T-sentence which I'd be able to write down and properly write down if I'm in the business of interpreting German in English. Now you might think, is writing down T-sentences something that is going to assist us with the theory of truth? And I think the waters were muddied here by the way Tarski presented his own theory. Tarski was a great logician, and he was very good at explaining how you can give an interpretation of a set of sentences in terms of the rather familiar devices of elementary logical languages, first-order quantification theory, for those of you who know about it. But he thought he was giving a theory of truth, and I think that muddied the waters, because I don't think he was. I think what he was showing you was the kind of thing you had to do to be able to interpret a language. You had to be able to interpret, and it's a posh way of saying you have to be able to interpret its lexicon, and you have to be able to interpret the syntax That is the way that elements of the lexicon can be put together to make up whole sentences. And if you can do that for every grammatical sentence of the language, you've got a complete interpretation of that language in your own language, the language you bring to the process. So understanding English and assuming that the powers of expression of German don't outrun the powers of expression of English, which they might do in some respects. That's what makes translation difficult. But if I assume that the languages are equally potent, equipotent, then of course I can produce such a sentence, a T-sentence in my own language for every sentence of German. And as I do that, I'll have been selecting subsentential elements of German as things that contribute to the meaning, in the way that we think that, for example, the endings of terms might contribute to the tense with which a message is delivered, that a sentence indicates, and so on. So that's something that we can do. And if we call doing that semantics, then the question is, how much do you learn about the kind of topics that bothered the scientists worried about whether, for example, we're really describing atoms or describing merely how science describes atoms, or the people worried about Dewey or Pragmatists and Rory and so on. How much does this process, the process of interpretation, take over and assist those projects? Well, I don't think very much, because although the semantics is, because of Tarski's influence and for various reasons connected with the formal logic of the situation, it's presented in terms of is true if and only if. The notion of truth is, in a sense, idle in all this. It's not, there's nothing assumed about it. And a way of seeing that was given to us by the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars in the 1950s and early 60s. Sellars invented what he called a dot notation. And a dot notation is simply a way of signaling whichever role it is that a term you're using has in your language. So to make this a bit clearer, let's suppose, again, that I'm in the project of saying in English what individual German sentences mean. Let's call German the object language. This is the phrase that's used, because that's the object of my inquiry. English, the language I'm using, is the meta-language. It's the language which I use to describe German, German sentences and their structure. Then the dot notation takes as input a a phrase or sentence, a subsentential element, a word perhaps, of English, and refers to the role that that word has in English. So to give an example, red in English is a red, dot red. What does that mean? Well, it says that red in English has the role, this role, red. Now, of course, you and I know that the word red, the role it has is of referring to a color. And we know which color it is, so I could spell that out further. But the dot notation just refers to that role. It doesn't identify it, it just refers to it. That's to be interpreted as red in English has this role. The D in front of this is actually deliberate, but I'm not going to explain it for people who aren't semantic theorists. It has this role, the role that, as a matter of fact or contingent, is played by the term red in English. Such interpretations are contingent. Red in English needn't have had that role, the word red. I don't know what historical contingencies underlay the emergence of the term red, spelt like that, sounding like this, red, I don't know what contingencies underlay the fact that that word came to have a particular role in English. But they were historical contingencies, and they could have been otherwise, because it's a contingent fact that any term has the meaning it does. Well, since such interpretations are contingent, they can't be minimal, or they can't all be deflated. There has to be something making them true. So if somebody says they're an overall semantic deflationist because truth has been deflated, they come up against the obstacle that semantic theses have to be regarded as contingent. They have to be regarded, the philosopher Peter Strawson gave a lovely description of them. He said, if you're giving a semantics of your own language, using your own language as both the object and the meta-language, which you can do, red in English is a red, then you're producing what he called degenerate contingent meta-statements. That's quite a mouthful, but it's degenerate because there's a sense in which I can't tell any English speaker anything using this kind of sentence. The English speaker already knows that red in English, he knows what role that has if he's an English speaker. So saying it's got that role is not giving him news. So that's why it's degenerate. Telling him that rot in German has that role is giving, or could be giving somebody news, if you give it in English. Rot in English has, rot in German has the red role. Well, that's interesting. That's how the Germans refer to red, because that's what we do with the word red. What Sellers makes it clear is that when you deliver a semantics, you're going to be standing on, or making use of, let's say, that's better than the metaphor, you're going to be making use of a huge amount of implicit knowledge of the meta-language, the language in which you describe the object language. And this is what semantic minimalists like Price and to some extent Horwich and Brandom insist on. They insist that in a sense semantics is a degenerate subject because you can't, as it were, escape your own awareness of the roles of the terms that you yourself use to describe a language. You're going to have to use a language of at least equal potency to the language which you're attempting to unravel. And that kind of stands in the way of achieving a philosophical understanding by doing this. You could, if you could do it for, say, a language like German, then that would be terrific. It would show that you've got basically a bilingual's knowledge of German. For any well-formed German sentence, you know what it means. A great achievement, not one that I possess, one I'm sure that many people in this room possess. But you can see that it's difficult because if you try to do the same for Eskimo or for Icelandic, Norwegian, whatever, they're languages you don't speak. Try and do it for those. You realize the magnitude of the learning task. But as you try to do it, you're going to be using your own language. You're not going to be, as it were, increasing your understanding. You might, I believe, increase your understanding of the grammar of your own language, but you mightn't even do that. It's extremely difficult. In fact, it's an unsolved problem to give a good algorithmic grammar of a natural language. That's why things like Google's grammar assistants or Word, Microsoft. If you use Microsoft Word and it corrects your grammar, it's quite often wrong. And it's certainly apt to deem ungrammatical sentences which are perfectly grammatical because their complexity has escaped it. That's not Microsoft's fault. It's not as though there's an off-the-peg grammar of English which it ought to be feeding in, but it isn't. It's that linguists haven't actually managed to come up with an algorithm which selects all and only syntactically well-formed sentences of English. So in that sense, grammar is an unsolved problem. But semantics is always going to be, in a sense, a matter of running on the spot, of failing to advance beyond where you are already. Because by using the dot notation, I think Sellers shows that you're going to always be relying on the role that you give terms in your own language, which you're using as a meta-language, in order to elucidate the meaning of a language, of a part of the object language. And that's why people like Chomsky, I always used to be puzzled by this. Chomsky sees himself as defending syntax against semantics. And I think Chomsky's skepticism about semantics, which I think is not usually very well expressed, nevertheless, I think at the core, the kernel of it is the view that semantics is not going to be a good device for increasing your knowledge of language as such. You can use semantics to increase your knowledge of a particular language which you treat as an object language by relying on your own. But your reliance on your own is going to be a kind of frog in the mug, which you know, as you go down, you'll find it grinning at you from the bottom of the mug. And I think that's what minimalists like Price and Brandom are pushing at when they talk about semantic minimalism. I don't think it's a very good phrase, and I don't think it's been philosophically very helpful. I think this may be a good place for me to finish. I've not quite gone for an hour, but I've gone for very nearly an hour. And I have a sense that the audience is slightly more sleepy than last night. So perhaps I've been more boring. Yes, I think what I want to do is resurrect, in the next lecture, I'm going to resurrect semantic differences. I'm going to talk about how, in spite of the sort of blanket use of Sellar's dot notation, you will nevertheless understand, you can nevertheless understand different roles that different kinds of terminology play. So we're going to look at the differences within language. I think this was something that Wittgenstein, perhaps unlike Dewey, I think unlike Dewey, certainly unlike Rory, and certainly unlike Brandom and Price, was very keen on emphasizing. Wittgenstein said that the motto, he very nearly chose as a motto for the investigations, the philosophical investigations, which is his greatest late work. He very nearly chose as a motto a sentence from King Lear, "I'll teach you differences." It's a sentence that Kent says to somebody. And I think that Wittgenstein's, as it were, the great message of Wittgenstein is not semantic minimalism. He was a minimalist he was a deflationist about truth, but he also thought that in spite of deflationism about truth, we could gain massive philosophical insight by looking at the differences between different parts of our language, different things that we say. Some things that we say function in very different ways from other things that we say. And this is resurrecting a difference which is in a sense smothered by the Duhem thesis. The Duhem thesis does not, as it were, it's not hospitable to the divisions that Wittgenstein wants to make. And these are divisions in function, and I'll talk more about those next tomorrow. So thank you.
Okay, thanks again for this essay on philosophy of Ophelia trying to get her drowned in a lake, at least partly. Questions, comments?
Question near the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just as a minor comment on your random exegesis.
Yes.
By my light, I thought it's precisely because we discursive creatures are not a chunk of metal that rusts, because we are not only stimulated or exposed to reality and facts, if you say so, but also that we are at the same time discursive creatures which are capable of establishing norms, and they're the missing piece of this pure inferentialism is augmented by Brandwin, by my lights, because there the reality comes in somehow. Thank you.
I think it may depend which text of Brandon's you concentrate on, actually. If you look at making it explicit, it seems to me that the inferentialism is more or less pure. So let me give a contrast between Brandom and Wittgenstein. At the very beginning of the investigations, Wittgenstein introduces us to what he calls a primitive language. And the primitive language is one of his builders. The builders are engaged in together building something. And builder A and builder B have got this primitive method of communication that A says things like slab to B, and B brings him a slab. Or A says brick, and B brings him a brick. So they're rather in the same sort of signaling state as the Bs. They don't make commitments with this language, they just give orders. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein says that there's signification in this. Slab signifies slab. This is shown by their behavior. Bricks signifies bricks. That's shown by their behavior. He calls it a primitive language, but he doesn't deny that it's a language. Brandom would deny that it's a language because there's not what he calls a downtown. There's no downtown. That is, there's no process of inferring one thing from another. There's no inferential relations between these signals. All there is a simple desire on the part of one builder, which is expressed by means of this one-word sentence, and a coordinated reaction by the other builder. And Wittgenstein says, don't bother about that. You've still got a signaling system, and you've still got reference. Now, Brandom's whole exercise in making it explicit and works following it, that was 1994, was to get us a conception of reference built entirely out of anaphora, out of anaphoric relations between individual elements in a sentence. So he took as primitive the quite complicated relationship that exists between, say, John went to town and he caught a bus, from which you can infer someone went to town and caught a bus. Now, you can only make that inference, and Brandom thought the fact that you make that inference was, as it were, the evidence which justifies you in saying that he refers to John. Because if it was John went to town and somebody else caught a bus, you couldn't infer somebody went to town and caught a bus. Those so-called anaphoric relations are what Brandom hoped in that time to be the building blocks out of which he could give you a syntactic account, an inferentialist account of sameness of reference, and hence an inferentialist account of reference. Well, now these are two entirely different projects. Wittgenstein's talking about the arrival of reference in a signaling system which is coordinated with aspects of reality. Brandom is giving you one in which you're just looking inside the language, inside its inferential relations. It's proof theory, if you like, which is why you call it syntactic. And it seems to me that's extremely different. It's true that in the John Locke Lectures, 2006, which came out as between doing and saying in 2008, I think, and in some of his later writings, Brandom, as it were, nods in the direction of the fact that you're an embodied animal responsive to causal processes from outside. But as far as I'm aware, he never does anything with that idea. I mean, it comes as a surprise, and he certainly never says, oh, so now we've got the idea of focusing attention on something in the world and having intelligent use of observations, so we don't have to be inferentialists. And the reason that he doesn't is I think he's enthralled to Sellars. And he thinks that there's, Sellars introduced I think the appalling metaphor of two spaces, the space of causation and the space of reason. And Brandom, I think, is locked into thinking of our transactions with the outside world as belonging to the space of causes. Therefore, they've got nothing to do with the space of reasons. Therefore, we don't get justification by processes which involve our relations to externality. Therefore, we don't have to make the kind of Wittgensteinian emphasis on attention fixing and successful behavior, or any of the things that I talked about in connection with Mercator and Ophelia. So I really think that I can defend my view of Brandom, although it's not an easy set of texts to interpret entirely. More? Oh, well, that seems to be it for tonight.
No, there is another question.
Oh, where?
From the back of the room, I'm here.
Oh, I see.
Maybe you can see me.
Hello.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think I want to ask another question, defending one of the people you kind of put into the defensive. Mm-hmm. So Davidson has actually something to say, I think, that is quite interesting in the context of your talk, and that makes at least a step or two into the direction of which you seem to be going, and this is the triangulation scenario where you have actually some sort of observation, and what's quite important is not just a single mind or single person observing a feature of the world, but actually two minds coordinating it or triangulating, as it were, their reactions to a stimulus in the world, and that goes some way towards what you seem to be sympathetic to, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I can't remember offhand, perhaps you can tell me, which paper and which date Davidson started talking about triangulation. I think it's, you see, he wrote a coherence theory of truth. Coherence theory of reference and truth, was it? Yeah. In about the 70s, 80s.
3 varieties of knowledge.
Sorry?
3 varieties of knowledge. Or something like that. Varieties of knowledge or something like that is the paper, I remember.
Do you remember roughly when? I don't. I've 1990. So it's a little bit later. I mean, Davidson certainly allies himself with Rorty. Davidson actually quoted one of the Rorty, wrote a Rorty quotation I didn't actually use in this presentation, to the effect that only a belief justifies another belief. He quotes that with great endorsement. He endorses it in some of his early work, and that's what I was talking of. I agree that later on Davidson has a more complex story, and he brings in a social element, which is very welcome. But I don't think he ever thought of backtracking on that Rortian kind of coherentism. I'm open to conviction. I don't mind in the least if Davidson changed his mind. In fact, I'd welcome him into the light. But I'm not a sufficient Davidson scholar to tell you whether he did or not. I'm sorry. It's not easy being a Davidson scholar. And I'm too lazy. Yes?
It's coming.
I would like to ask here a symbolism question. When I look at your explanation of importance of red,
Importance of
this red
the red, yeah.
appears in an Apple computer. Now the Apple computer remembers the symbolism of it, the story of Newton. The story of Newton is that he was looking onto a falling apple, and at the same time was looking at the moon. So the impression of this, I want to ask your opinion. Right? The impression of this is that this very striking. The conclusion, when you learn that he concluded that the forces law of the moon and the falling apple are the same. After all, the phenomenon as such is completely different.
Yes.
So where do you place this impression, which I guess is correct, that this Newton person must have been a really clever observer and scientist?
Everybody, I think, admits that it was an amazing move of Newton. I mean, the elliptical orbit of the planets had been known since Kepler. The way apples fell had been known since time immemorial. To unify the two, to see them as capable of being explained under the same set of laws, that was an amazing intellectual achievement. Nobody denies that. That's why Newton is a god among scientists. Because on the face of it, there's nothing in the observation which relates to them at all. Entirely different phenomena. And indeed, it wasn't so very long since there was a sort of Aristotelian embargo on thinking that anything in the heavens obeyed anything like sublunary laws. That was, as it were, blasphemy. So Newton's achievement in unifying those, the force that made the apple fall with the force that kept the planets in their elliptical orbits was absolutely astonishing. Of course, it made him the most famous man in Europe, rightly so. I don't think that though, was a particular credit to Newton as an observer. I think he relied on Kepler's observations of the planets and what Kepler had deduced about the form of their motions, and presumably he relied on Galileo's measurements of the acceleration of falling objects, and perhaps work since Galileo, I don't know. But certainly he's standing on he himself said famously that he's standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think two of the giants he must have had in mind are Kepler and Galileo. So I don't think Newton deserves his place at the top of the pyramid of scientists because of his especial skills as an observer. He was a good observer. He went on to observe colors, of course, using the prism to split light and to come up with views about the wave theory of light. But it wasn't observation that gave him Principia, I don't think. It was the pure power of the mathematical deduction, that if this is the way objects behave, this is the way you'd expect apples to fall, and this is the way you'd expect the planets to orbit. Yeah. Well, of course, in the 19th century, with Hamilton, the arrival of Hamilton's mathematics for dynamics, and especially the work of Heinrich Hertz, you got in effect a way of describing the laws of motion without making a primitive use of the notion of force. So the gravitational force was, as it were, subsumed under stories about acceleration. You did the whole thing using the calculus. And that may or may not have been an advantage, because after all, if you don't understand force in connection with things like gravity, you're never going to understand it. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe it's a dud notion, but that's not something that I think Newton thought. And then, of course, with the arrival of relativity theory, and especially the general theory, you get an entirely different picture of gravity altogether. That's 300 years later, well, 200 and a bit years later. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask another question about the notion of observation you brought forward.
Yes.
If I understood you correctly, you wanted to say that coherentists like Davidson and Rory, what they're missing is, well, some kind of touch to reality via observation.
Yes.
But could they not say, well, we have no opposition to the notion of observation at all, because what is observation if not something composed of two elements? One thing is the causal connection, and the other thing is the conceptual connection, so we have beliefs. So are we not again where we started from? So maybe you could you explain the term again?
I think that's almost exactly what they would say, but I think it's just includes the fatal error. They're absolutely right that observation requires interpretation. Dewey is saying that. Before him, Peirce said it. James said it. James had this lovely metaphor. A sensation is like a client that gives its case to a lawyer and then has to put up with whatever the lawyer says about it. And that's a very nice sort of metaphor for the silence. But of course, Kant had said it before: intuitions without concepts are blind. Concepts without intuitions are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. So everybody's agreed that observations require interpretation. The fatal mistake is to think that therefore you can hive off the observation bit and just see the interpretation, the belief that's in your head, as another element in your inward-looking whole, fit for inferential relations with others. And justification only starts then. And my claim is no, justification started when you realized what needed to be observed in order to get a belief. I mean, think of the difference between my wife asks me, are there potatoes in the cellar? I can't remember, but I'll toss a coin and say yes. Am I justified? No. I'm not justified in saying that there's, even if by magic the coin toss makes me believe that there are potatoes in the cellar. So it puts the belief into my web of belief, and I start making inferences. Since there are potatoes in the cellar, we must have gone out and bought them last week, and so on and so on. I bring to bear all my knowledge in a supremely rational way. But there's something wrong with me because I didn't get the belief that there's a potato and that there are potatoes in the cellar in the right way. And what I wanted to stress again and again is that I know that, and I know that if I suddenly found myself possessed of a belief, and I've got no story about its pedigree in experience and observation, well, then I'd start to fairly rapidly start to doubt my own sanity. I'd be like somebody who has voices in their head which tell them this, that, and the other. But that's not the rational and normal situation. The normal situation is that I'm in control, I pretty well know what I've observed, and I pretty well know what I have to observe, that is the practices in the world that I have to go through in order to become justified in saying that there are potatoes in the cellar. Namely, I have to go down to the cellar and look, or similar. I might use an instrument, I might rely on somebody's testimony, but somewhere or another I've got to go through a process which I believe puts me in a better position to give you a true verdict on whether there are potatoes in the cellar. And it's there that my rationality lies. That's my claim. Whereas for Sellers and the followers of Sellers, who make this dichotomy between the space of causes and the space of reasons, it's not there that my rationality lies. Until the moment that there's a belief in my head, I'm just like the iron rusting. And that's the picture I think is fatal and generates this picture that McDowell parodied as, or satirized as the idea of the web of belief spinning frictionlessly in the void. There's no friction in the sense that there's no external input that matters. It's not that there's no external input for Brandom and post-Salasians, but there's none that is an exercise of reason. And I'm going to say, yes, there is.
So as a physicist, I'm used to using mathematics to describe nature, and
yes.
Therefore I know a little bit about mathematics, and therefore when I think of truth, I can't help to think of mathematical truth.
Yeah.
Now, of course, to get access to that, I have to use English or German as what you may call a meta-language. And when I hear you using this meta-language to talk about truth, then I can't really get hold of the truth as much as I can in mathematics. And I wonder how mathematicians or physicists can so well agree on the concept of truth in mathematics while they use meta-languages like English to exchange their thoughts about this. So is there something hardwired in our brains that sort of is very mathematical? Not in everybody's brain, perhaps, but so how can mathematicians agree what truth is worldwide, although they have only that mathematical language to share?
Yes, well, I talked a little bit about the philosophy of mathematics last night. Could I just ask if you were here? Because you're here. Oh, well, I didn't say enough, evidently. I don't want to just repeat myself. I mean, from time immemorial, from the time of Plato, mathematics has stood out as it were, the real problem for empiricism. Empiricism, the idea that all our knowledge comes through the senses. Mathematics is the stumbling block because it's a prime case of knowledge. It's a case, as you rightly say, where, in effect, all competent people agree on the results. And yet, we have no sense experience that seems to bear sufficiently on the whole edifice of mathematical knowledge. With mathematics, we can easily give a mathematical treatment of things like zilliagons. These are polygons which have 1,000 sides or 10,000 sides. Doesn't matter. And of course, our sense experience is incapable of discriminating such things. So it's been a problem. The most promising approach for philosophers towards diffusing it was probably some combination of conventionalism, that's trying to assimilate mathematics to something like chess, where it's fairly obvious that we made the rules, and we could alter the rules. You could try that, or you could try to say mathematics doesn't really have its own subject matter, it's an elaboration of logic. And logic doesn't have its own subject matter. Logic as it were, gives you the inferential structures that you've got to use no matter what subject matter you're dealing with. And mathematics is more like that. Now, the logicist program of the early 20th century ran into all kinds of trouble, and although it's still not dead, it's not popular either. But at present, as far as I'm aware, there's no compelling philosophy of mathematics. There are various different schools. Amongst the most promising at one point were mathematical intuitionists, which took from Kant the idea that somehow you could understand mathematics if you understood time. And so the two sort of great a priori structures which structure our thinking about the world could be somehow understood together. And that would have been a nice idea, but intuitionism required a weakening and a change in classical mathematics. Intuitionists had a problem with the idea of the completed infinity, and hence they had a problem with the law of the excluded middle. And that was a step too far for most classically inclined mathematicians. So, yes, I think that, it's a great, Kant thought that avoiding skepticism was the scandal of philosophy because he thought it hadn't been done. And I think getting a sensible conception of our knowledge of mathematics is a contemporary scandal of philosophy. I don't think it's been done. I think it ought to be done. I wish I knew how to do it.
Somebody around here?
Could I just say one thing, though? It's dangerous, I think, and I'm not sure it's going to lead anywhere to say that it's some kind of reflection of an innate structure of our own minds, because that raises the question, well, could our minds have been otherwise? Now, they could obviously have been otherwise in the sense that we didn't understand any mathematics any more than animals do. But could they have been otherwise in the sense that with a different structure we'd have a different mathematics? Well, what would that be like? Because mathematics, of course, appeals by its inexorability. That's why we talk about knowledge. It's not as if they're alternatives. This is the way you go. Thinking of that as contingent upon a structure of our minds which might have been otherwise is already kind of deflating that certainty. It's already saying, well, if you look closer, if you could imagine better, you could imagine a different mathematics. But that seems to be the difficulty. At least when it comes to things like number theory. Geometry, of course, there are other things. When people began to realize the independence of Euclid's fifth postulate, Lobachevsky and Riemann, then geometry started to lose some of its certainty.
Okay, one more question, please.
Thank you, Simon. I think you did a great job showing that those pragmatists who rely on inferentialism or coherentism ignore that our epistemic practices rely on an engagement with reality around, roughly perception and observation, an engagement which is, however, mediated by capacities and social embedding. But at one point, I wonder whether you ignored that message yourself. When you described the bees, engaging in the waggle dance as observing, both the foraging bees observing the location of honey and the bees back in the hive as observing the waggle dance. I'm very happy to grant that they perceive,
yes.
But observation, taking a leaf out of Dewey's book, many books, and your book, books, differs from mere observation in at least two respects, I reckon. One is, in observing, I intentionally attend to particular aspects of what I perceive, and I interpret it. And B, I can re-engage my perceptual capacities both to correct my perceptual beliefs and to, expand them. So I wonder whether,
Yeah.
some people would claim bees can do all that,
Right.
and I want to leave that open, but I think the important conceptual point is, observation doesn't equate to perception.
Good. I take that point very well, Hanyo, and thank you for it. I was a little careless in jumping to observation there. And of course, a bee, it's certainly causally receptive to whatever aspects of its journey and the food source and so on it manages to communicate. It manages to, if we go very behaviorist, it manages to transmit to others a behavior routine, which means that they're successful in collecting honey from that direction and that distance. Pollen, I'm sorry, from that direction and that distance. And you don't have to anthropomorphize too much. In fact, you have not to anthropomorphize too much. I think that's exactly right. And of course, I'm not trying to say or suggest that simple behaviorism suffices to give us an understanding of our own linguistic powers. I don't think it does. I don't think simple behaviorism cuts it. It's a very difficult question to know what kind of elaboration one would like to make. As far as I know, the best attempt on this was Jonathan Bennett's book Linguistic Behavior. It was written, I think, in '76, thereabouts, and was unfortunately, I think, not taken up as it should have been in the literature. But he starts with two phenomena of animals. He calls registration and goal-directed behavior. Registration is a kind of primitive perception or primitive causal responsiveness to aspects of the environment. Goal-directed behavior is doing whatever satisfies the animal's necessities, at least in the beginning. And on those bases, he asks what more we need to approach full-scale linguistic abilities. And it's quite a lot. There's no question it's quite a lot. But what's interesting in Bennett's approach is it's thoroughly ecological. That is, it's going to see our capacities for thought as arising out of signaling capacities. The question is exactly how. But at no point are you going to forget that causal responsiveness is at the foot of representational power and of rational ability to respond to the world. So thank you. No, I mean, I think that that's very well taken. I didn't mean to just say there's nothing to us except animal signalers. That would be a behavioristic reduction, which we certainly shouldn't make. But of course, remembering Dewey, the question arises, what then do we do? And it's very difficult to tell a story about the behavioral elaboration, which helps there. People like Millikan have tried, and, well, as you know, but I don't think they're very successful.
Okay, I think that's enough for tonight. Let me remind you of the third talk tomorrow at 7:30, and before we all go, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you.